Part 1. The Boy with Restless Dreams. In the gentle hills of Colombia, a small town sat quietly under the sun. Surrounded by green slopes that seemed to stretch endlessly, here lived a boy named Pablo, in a modest house of wood and stone. His windows opened onto fields that shimmered gold in the afternoon sun. And the scent of earth after rain filled the air. Pablo's mother worked tirelessly, her hands rough from scrubbing and cooking, while his father, quiet and thoughtful, told stories about patience. About seeds and soil, about how the land rewarded those who waited. But Pablo was different. From the earliest days, his eyes wandered beyond the rooftops, beyond the fields, searching for something far greater than his small world. While other children played football or climbed trees for mangoes, Pablo stood apart, imagining palaces taller than mountains, crowds cheering his name, treasures stacked as high as the clouds. One day, he whispered, "I will not just walk these streets. I will own them." Softly, even as a child, Pablo's cleverness became apparent. He understood people, their desires, their fears, their weaknesses. One story the townspeople remembered: a broken bicycle he once owned, rusted, bent, seemingly worthless. It might have been discarded by anyone else, but Pablo convinced another boy it was rare, almost magical. By the end of the day, he had traded it for far more than its true value. Lying in bed that night, he realized something profound. Thought balloon, with courage and the right words, "I can shape the world to my will." Softly, as he grew, Pablo's ambition burned ever brighter. One evening, he climbed the hill outside town with his friend Mateo. The sun was melting into the horizon, painting the sky with gold and red, the fields stretching endlessly below. Mateo plucked a blade of grass and chewed it lazily. "Why do you always look so far away, Pablo? Aren't these fields enough? Aren't the houses enough?" Pablo's eyes burned with ambition. "No, Mateo, these fields are too small, these houses are too few. I want the world to know me. I want to walk into a room and have every head turn. I want to live in houses bigger than palaces, and ride in cars faster than the wind." Mateo laughed. "Dreams that big, they never end well. Better to be happy with what you have." Pablo smiled faintly, not in agreement, but in knowing. "You do not understand me." Softly, that night, after a simple meal of beans, rice, and vegetables, his mother whispered a prayer under her breath. "May his dreams bring light, not darkness." Softly, the night offered no answer. Only the soft chorus of crickets, ambient sound, and the boy with restless dreams grew taller, sharper, and hungrier, stepping slowly toward a destiny that would one day shake the world. Part 2. Whispers of Fortune. As Pablo entered his teenage years, his cleverness evolved into ambition. He began experimenting with small schemes, little tricks that tested his wit against the world. Some were innocent, convincing merchants to give him a few extra coins. But others were bolder. He discovered that people were predictable. They wanted admiration, respect, and attention. If you could speak to those desires, you could bend the world ever so slightly in your favor. One evening, he approached a group of boys planning to start a small business selling sweets at the town market. Pablo offered to manage it, promising they would earn more than they imagined. They laughed at first, but his confidence persuaded them. By the end of the week, the small venture had turned a modest profit, more than any of them expected. Pablo's mind raced with new possibilities. He could multiply his gains, grow his influence, and rise above the ordinary. Each success whispered to him, "This is only the beginning." Softly, but ambition, when untempered, is like a fire. It can warm, but it can also burn. Pablo began to feel impatient with the slow pace of life. He saw others around him working years for small rewards, and it frustrated him. The world was too vast, too rich, too full of opportunity to wait for slowly earned success. One night, as he lay under the stars, he imagined two roads. One road was long, steep, and filled with honest work. It promised security, peace, and respect earned over time. The other was dark, fast, and full of temptation. It promised wealth, influence, and immediate recognition. But the shadows that cloaked it were dangerous. Many who walked it never returned. Pablo felt the pull of the shadows. The idea of slow growth seemed unbearable. He wanted results now, rewards now, power now. And so, he chose the road of shadows. At first, the path seemed magical. Rewards came quickly. People began to notice him. He became a figure of fascination in the town, handing gifts to the poor, making bold statements, showing that he could provide more than anyone else. Children cheered, parents whispered, and Pablo's name began to spread. But with every gain, a shadow lengthened behind him. The choices he made brought admiration and fear in equal measure. As his influence grew, so did the weight of responsibility, the fear of betrayal, and the need to protect what he had gained. Even in his earliest successes, the first whispers of caution began to follow him, quiet murmurs from those who noticed the boy who never stopped, who never paused, who always wanted more. Part 3. Rise to Power. As Pablo moved along the road of shadows, the world began to take notice. What had once been clever trades and small ventures now grew into a network of influence. He was no longer a boy dreaming under the stars. He was a young man commanding attention. He discovered quickly that influence was more than coins or charm. It was respect, fear, and loyalty combined. Those who followed him felt a strange mixture of admiration and caution. Drawn by his charisma, but wary of the power he wielded, Pablo's generosity became a tool as much as a virtue. He helped families in need, built small homes, gave food to children. The townspeople called him a hero, yet those who watched closely saw something more, a man who would accept nothing less than complete loyalty. Even as he gave, he measured. Every gift, every favor, every act of kindness built his empire, and with each new success, the whispers grew louder. This boy, he will be more than anyone imagines. Softly, the young man also learned the importance of patience within ambition. Though impatient by nature, Pablo understood that timing could magnify his efforts. He observed, he waited, he struck only when the moment was right. Slowly, his influence spread beyond the town, touching neighboring villages, and eventually reaching the cities where decisions were made. With each step forward, his life became more complex. Houses grew taller, cars grew faster, wealth piled up like the golden sun over the mountains. Yet the higher he climbed, the more he realized the road of shadows had hidden costs. By his mid-20s, Pablo had achieved the kind of success that most only dreamed of. He lived in houses with walls taller than any tree, drove cars that roared like storms, and owned lands that stretched far into the horizon. To the poor, he was a savior. To the ambitious, a rival. And to the cautious, a man to fear. But wealth, as he discovered, is both a gift and a trap. The very things that made him powerful also made him vulnerable. Every night, Pablo lay awake in grand rooms, surrounded by luxury, yet feeling the first twinges of unease. Guards patrolled outside, alert to danger that seemed always just beyond reach. He was surrounded by people who smiled, but whose eyes often held secrets. Even in his grandest moments, Pablo began to notice the weight of all he had built. Power and wealth are heavy, and the higher you rise, the harder the fall. The Hill of Reflection. One night, Pablo returned to the hill he had visited as a child. The stars shone brilliantly above. The fields stretched endlessly beneath. He thought about his mother, her prayers, his father's stories of patience. For the first time, he felt the faintest stir of doubt. He had chosen the road of shadows. It gave him speed, wealth, attention, but at a cost he could not yet measure. He whispered to the night sky, "If I keep walking this road, what will I become?" Softly, the wind carried no answer. Only the quiet sound of the world around him, calm and unchanging, as if reminding him that nature and time always move at their own pace. Part 4. The Weight of Shadows. As Pablo's name spread far beyond the valleys and hills of Colombia, his world grew larger and heavier. The mansions he built stood like fortresses, with gates of iron and walls that reached for the sky. Inside were chandeliers, golden staircases, and rooms filled with treasures. But every glittering object carried with it an invisible cost. The more he had, the more he feared losing it. The more people surrounded him, the less he trusted them. What once began as dreams of greatness had now become a burden that never left his shoulders. Pablo's generosity continued. He built schools, houses, and football fields for the poor. Entire villages called him El Patron with reverence. For them, he was not just a man. He was a legend who gave where others took. Children shouted his name with joy. Parents blessed him in whispers. Even those who doubted him were forced to admit he had given more to the forgotten than any government had. But behind the smiles and gratitude, there lingered fear, for all who walked the road of shadows carried darkness with them. And Pablo was no exception. The world beyond Colombia began to notice him too. Powerful nations whispered his name in secret meetings. Leaders feared his reach. Journalists wrote his story with awe and dread. To some, he was a symbol of rebellion against the powerful. To others, he was a storm that could not be contained. And through it all, Pablo himself wrestled with a truth he could never escape. The road he walked gave him everything, but it demanded everything in return. At night, in the silence of his grand estates, he often stood by the window, staring into the darkness beyond the walls. He listened to the distant sounds of dogs barking, cars passing, and sometimes faint echoes of gunfire in the hills. Is this what greatness feels like? He whispered to himself, softly, to be admired and feared all at once. His reflection in the glass looked back at him, not the boy with restless dreams anymore, but a man whose eyes carried both pride and weariness. A visit to his mother. One day, he returned to the modest house where he was born. His mother, older now, welcomed him with tears in her eyes. She held his hands, rougher than before, scarred by years of work and worry. "You've built so much, Pablo," she said softly, "but I see a shadow in your eyes. Tell me, are you truly happy?" For a moment, Pablo was silent. No words came, only the weight of all he carried, and for the first time, he could not answer his mother. He embraced her tightly, holding on longer than he ever had, as if clinging to the one piece of his life untouched by shadows. The burden of greatness. As he left that night, walking back toward his fleet of cars, he realized a truth that lingered in his heart. Greatness was not free, it never was. For every palace he built, there was a home left in ruins. For every cheer he received, there was a whisper of fear. And for every dream fulfilled, another piece of himself was lost. Pablo walked into the night, the road stretching endlessly ahead, its shadows deeper than ever, and though he walked with pride, the weight of those shadows followed close behind. Part 5. Enemies in the dark. The brighter Pablo's star shone, the darker the shadows around him grew. For every friend he made, an enemy rose in silence. For every hand that shook his with loyalty, another waited with betrayal. The world of power is never quiet, and Pablo learned this lesson deeply. Whispers of his name reached those who ruled in distant lands, and they saw not a hero, not a dreamer, not a builder of homes, but a threat, a storm that might spread beyond control. Governments turned their eyes toward him. Men in suits, with pens sharper than any sword, declared him dangerous, and with that declaration, the hunters began to move. At first, Pablo laughed at their attempts. "They don't know who I am," he told his closest circle. "They don't know the people love me." And it was true. In the villages and towns, Pablo was a symbol. To the poor, he was hope itself. To his people, he was a protector. But beyond those lands, in distant capitals, his legend was not one of kindness, but of fear. The hunters grew bolder. They built alliances, they sent letters and threats, and eventually, they sent men. Planes circled overhead, helicopters thundered across the skies. The sound of boots marching echoed in places Pablo once called safe. The walls of his great houses trembled with each passing storm, and though his guards stood ready with weapons and courage, the truth lingered in every corner. No wall is tall enough, no gate is strong enough, to keep the world away forever. The circle of trust. In this time, Pablo began to look closely at those beside him. He searched their eyes, their smiles, their words. Loyalty is the rarest treasure, and more fragile than glass. Some men stayed by his side, ready to face the fire with him. Others drifted, tempted by promises whispered from his enemies. Pablo learned that the greatest battles are not fought in open fields, but in whispers, in meetings behind closed doors, and in the hearts of men who once swore loyalty. A man against the world. One night, he stood on the balcony of his mansion. The city lights stretched before him, sparkling like 1,000 stars. But in those lights, he did not see beauty. He saw hunters, enemies, traps waiting to close. "I gave them schools," he whispered to the night. "I gave them fields to play, homes to live, and hope to hold." His voice trembled softly, "And still, they chase me." The wind carried no answer, only silence. A silence heavy enough to crush the strongest heart. Yet in his chest, the fire burned brighter than ever. He would not bow, he would not yield, for Pablo had walked too far along the road of shadows to turn back now. The boy who once dreamed on a hill had become a man who stood defiant before the world itself. And though he felt the weight of hunters behind him, he whispered to himself, "If they come for me, I will rise higher still. Part 6. The Fall of the King. The storm that Pablo had long felt approaching finally arrived. The hunters were no longer shadows in the distance. They were at his doorstep. Their helicopters thundered like angry skies. Their boots shook the earth, and their eyes searched for one man, Pablo Escobar. His empire, once untouchable, began to tremble. The mansions that had seemed eternal now felt fragile. The allies who once swore loyalty began to vanish. Some betrayed him, others fled into the night. The world that Pablo had built with iron and fire, with gold and generosity, was now cracking apart, piece by piece. But still, Pablo fought, like a lion refusing to kneel. He moved through the city he once ruled, not as a king upon his throne, but as a hunted man, moving house to house, street to street. Each day, he looked over his shoulder. Each night, he slept with one eye open. The road of shadows had given him everything, and now it was taking everything back. The lonely streets, the people still whispered his name, some with love, some with fear, but they no longer shouted it in the open. The danger of speaking his name was too great, and Pablo, the man once adored by thousands, now walked the streets with only the echo of his footsteps for company. He remembered the hill of his childhood, the stars, his mother's words, his father's patience, and he wondered, was this the price all along? Softly, was greatness always meant to end this way? The last chase. The hunters closed in, their radios buzzed, their guns ready. Every street narrowed, every corner tightened, until there was nowhere left to run. On that final day, Pablo stood in a small room, the sounds of soldiers echoing all around him. Shouts filled the air, the world he had built, collapsing in a storm of noise and fire. He looked out the window one last time, at the city he had once ruled, at the streets where children had once called his name, and for a brief moment, he smiled, not as a king, not as a villain, but as the boy he once was, dreaming of greatness beneath the stars. The end of the road. When the shots rang out, the world changed forever. The road of shadows, long and winding, had reached its end. The boy who had risen higher than anyone imagined, who had built dreams from dust and fire, now lay silent, his story closed, but never forgotten. And though the hunters claimed victory, the legend of Pablo lived on, in whispers, in stories, in the memories of those who had seen both his light and his darkness. Part 7. The Echo of a Legend. The road of shadows had ended, but the story of Pablo did not fade away. Across the hills and valleys of Colombia, his name still lingered, in whispers, in songs, in quiet conversations at night. Children who never met him asked their parents, was Pablo a hero, or was he a villain? And the parents, never quite knowing how to answer, simply said, he was both, and neither. He was a man. The world remembers. The world outside Colombia painted him in many colors. Some saw him as a dangerous outlaw. Others remembered the man who built homes, schools, and football fields for the poor who had nothing. In stories told at dinner tables, in books written by strangers, and in films watched across oceans, Pablo's life became larger than the man himself. A legend, a warning, a tale of light and shadow entwined. His family's memory. For his family, he was not the legend. He was simply Pablo, a son who once brought flowers to his mother, a brother who once laughed loudly at the dinner table, a father who once told stories to his children beneath the stars. They remembered the man behind the name, not the hunter, not the hunted, but the man who had dreams, and tried to grasp the world with both hands. The lesson of two roads. In the end, Pablo's story is not only about power, or riches, or fear, it is about the choices we make, the roads we walk, the road of light, and the road of shadows. Pablo walked both, and though he reached heights no one imagined, the shadows followed him to the very end. A whisper beneath the stars. If you listen closely, on quiet nights in Colombia, beneath the stars that once guided him as a boy, you may still hear his story carried by the wind, not of a saint, not of a devil, but of a man who dared to dream beyond his world, and like all who dream too greatly, he paid the price for walking the road of shadows, the final rest. So now, let his story rest. Let the storms of his past fade into silence. Let the whispers turn into lessons. And let the boy on the hill, the one who once gazed at the stars with restless eyes, finally sleep, beneath the same sky that still shines. For all who dare to dream.